Should lay these out in order so you know which order they go back in. So here we've got the lens mount. The lens mount has our brass cam in it, as I've said, that couples to the rangefinder. That's quite stiff. That needs to be cleaned. Taken apart and cleaned and lubricated lightly. We have the coupling lever here. That couples to the diaphragm in the lens. Under that we have this shim. Now it's worth noting that that shim goes underneath that lever and not the other way around. We have this lever and its return spring. That couples to that small cam, and that small cam in turn couples to this depth of field pointer. That small cam can come out. I can feel these parts are just lightly bit sticky. We've got this spacer. Underneath the spacer, I'll just pull that spring off. I can see the other depth of field pointer. See if I can get that rotated and lifted out of its mount. These components are quite lightly built. They're easily damaged. It's worth being very cautious about disassembling things like this. That pointer doesn't want to drop out. That's interesting. Not sure why that's so reluctant to come out. I know on some of the earlier lenses there was an extra, like a double step on this piece, and they were hard to get in and out. What was the other one like by comparison? Did that come out easily? Came out easier than that one did. Yeah, just wriggled out. What have we got left in here? Well, we've got our return spring. That was for the depth of field pointer I've just taken out. I want to see if I can lift that off its post, because these springs are pretty delicate and they are very easy to damage while you're working on the rest of the mount. If I can get that spring off the post, yeah, that's it, that's fine. It's an exceptionally fine spring, that. They're very easily damaged. So how's this held together? Well, the focus scale ring here, this component, is held into the mount by wedges. We've got this long piece here with a wedge at each side, and a wedge here and a wedge here. And between them, those wedges lock into a groove on this piece and hold it all together. So we need to get this apart. So we can take out the 4 screws here. This is a fairly early lens, I can tell by the construction. They changed the details of the construction during the manufacturing life of these lenses, and some of them are quite different. I think later lenses even had plastic components here for some of the focal length, is possibly not all the focal length. and some of them had a single screw in these wedges, where this one has got 2 screws in these wedges. Pull that wedge back out of the way. And this here, that's a stud for the spring, hooks over that, so it's not easy to get that out. You can't just get at it with a screwdriver. Normally I find if I can pull the other ones back, pull that end out, yeah, that's enough. I can leave that thing in place, not have to disturb it. So these components just need to be cleaned. You can see a lot of black grease there, and likewise there's a lot of black grease here, and that's all quite dry and sticky. And it just needs to be cleaned away with some naphtha. So I'll start with the mount here, or this piece rather. And you can tell that's probably a graphite loaded grease, just given the amount of blackness that's in it. And that the blackness doesn't really want to come away. The darker marking here, I don't know whether that's where it's rubbed through the anodizing on the lens, on the mount, and I'm seeing staining of the aluminium there. I really don't know. I'll get that as clean as I can. And the inside too, of course. Yeah, there's quite a bit of, it was like yellow oil staining there. Let's get that wedge out. This track you see here, that's to keep the springs from getting tangled up in the mechanism. Yeah, it's quite sticky with, there's 2 lots of grease going on there by the looks of it. There's some grey, presumably graphite grease, and then there's some light coloured stuff. Which was presumably not graphite grease, and that has dried out too, and left like a waxy deposit on there. So probably grease from 2 different sources. The clear stuff may even have, oh, it won't have come from the helical, because the helical was quite black too. So I don't really know where that's come from. Of course, it's possible someone's had the lens apart before, so we're seeing 2 generations of it. Lubricant. Well, that's that piece. That's probably good enough. Let's have a look at this piece. Now this is pretty grimy with it. That's cleaning fairly well. And the green colour you see, I think that's some sort of coating. Now I'm just running a toothpick around that groove. This is where those wedges that hold it together run, and I'm just using a toothpick to run around here and remove any packed in dirt and dried grease. And where this green coloured piece around here is, as I say, that's probably a coating that was put on there, a low friction coating. That's the surface that most of these components run around, and they need to be very low friction, otherwise they stick. If there's any stickiness to those pointers, the whole mechanism tends to bind up because of the effect of gearing through these tiny teeth and the gears on the back here, this gear set here. And the two pointers of course counter rotate, and that whole mechanism, if you push it from the wrong end, it's very, very stiff. So it needs to be as free running as possible. Now here I'm seeing a lot more of that yellowish grease. Now that's up at the focus mount end of it, that's up at this end of it. So that means that that was probably a clear grease in there at one stage. And of course it was a grey, silver grey grease when I took the lens apart. So it means that someone's had it apart and re-greased it at some stage. Now I'm getting these pieces as clean as I can get them. And these wedges. The wedges have got some coating on them. It's grey in this case. Now that's some low friction coating. I don't know what it is. I would say it is something like Teflon. It's certainly, I've got nothing to put it, if it was gone I've got nothing to put it back. Right, so I'm just going to check this. I'm going to try assembling this. Now we've got our pointer here for our depth, our focus scale, and that's got to run somewhere near the numbers. Now I'm just hooking this on here so that the wedge at this end fits into place. That rotates smoothly. Lubrication. So we're lubricating this. I'm just applying some molybdenum paste into that groove that those wedges run into. Not applying a lot, but I'm just trying to get an even cover. Of the other surfaces, it's difficult to tell what actually comes in contact because it's almost like it's floating on those wedges. I've just given a wipe onto that flat surface there. Let's swing this into place. Now, in order to get this on, I've really got to take the wedge and slide it under this track, this brass track, because I can't get it in from the other side. See if we can get this hooked in correctly. That's hooked in. And that wedge goes in there. I'll put this couple of screws in place and then see about adjusting things. Basically, the idea of adjusting the position of the wedges is that you want the lens to be able to rotate freely, but if they're too loose, then there'll be rattle in the lens. You'll be able to detect rattle. Now if that means that basically things aren't staying in line, and it would mean effectively your focus was shifting about. So you don't want any obvious rattle in it. By the same token, you don't want it too tight, because otherwise it binds up. The focus will be stiff, because a lot of these components are aluminium. They're prone to galling. If you've got pieces of metal rubbing together, they can create a high friction surface between them. So we started off, we didn't move this pin to start off with, so I'm going to start by adjusting the position of the wedge completely opposite that to make sure that this still turns smoothly, but that I haven't got rattle in this plane. At the moment it feels quite good. I'm just going to tighten those screws down and see how that goes. As you tighten the screws, sometimes it affects things like that. Excuse me, yeah, there's a little bit of play there. I'm just going to slacken those screws off slightly and move that wedge in slightly. Try again. That's taken the play out of it, still moves smoothly. I'll tighten the screws on the other wedges and check what it's like across those two. Well, I can certainly feel movement there. I'll try moving this wedge in slightly. Well, that's taken all the play out of it. It's pretty good. I would say that it's almost a little bit tight, so I'm just going to loosen those screws off slightly. And I'm just pulling the lens inwards towards me here, which should push that wedge back a bit, and try it again. Well, that's smoother. There's a little bit of play there though. I think there's probably too much play. It's hard getting the balance of this right. Oh, that feels okay. Certainly smooth enough, and there's no rattle in it. That's good. So that part's good. And I can start cleaning these other components up and putting them back in one by one. The first thing to start with is this depth of field pointer. This was the one that was a struggle to get out of the lens body. I'm just getting these surfaces. You can see that there's an awful lot of dirt on there. Some of that would be dried grease. You can see it here. None of that should be there. This should really be clean and dry. That would have created stickiness, and that stickiness would have been the reason the depth of field pointers were reluctant to move. That's okay. Yeah, that fitted in here. Memory. See if that pointer wriggles in. Yeah, it does. It really does wriggle in. It's not easy to drop. You can't just drop that into place. Now it's return spring. One end goes over that pin. Getting these in place is never easy. With a bit of luck, one end of the spring is slightly stretched compared to the other and is easier to push over the pin. That was it. Okay, so I can hook that spring over the hook on the depth of field pointer. At least that's the theory. Okay, and this separator's job is to separates the two depth of field pointers because they counter rotate. If they were rubbing against each other they would have quite a high friction. This is covered in something quite sticky. I presume it's grease. See the colour of that. Doubtless when that grease was put on there it was a nice slippery graphite based grease. See the dirty yellow, that's the yellows of the oil content of the binder. One surface of this is almost has a rough feel to it. I don't know whether that's baked on grease. It certainly doesn't look like a low friction material, put it that way. Normally these rings have a polished look, much like that on both sides. I don't know why this one's got this sort of almost a rough finish to it. I'm just going to run a toothpick over this so I can detect what the surface feels like. I don't want to use a metal tool on it because I might scratch it and create more problems than I started off with. But a wooden toothpick won't do that. Well, that feels okay. I'm not entirely I think that's wonderful. I'm going to rub a bit of graphite onto there, and the graphite I'm going to use is from a soft lead pencil. If I can find the one I want. Yeah, here we go. This will just create a nice dry low friction surface. That's fine. This ring, there's a notch in this ring here. The ring goes on there. That little pin on that ring goes into that notch. Just stretch this spring out so that it's not trapped behind it. That depth of field pointer should move fairly promptly now. Oh, it does. That's good. So that was the first depth of field pointer. That small cam needs to go in place now. It's important that this isn't bent. It has three areas that it's working in. the larger solid pin runs in this little track here. The hole is where the setting lever at the back, that's got a pin on it, that's where that connects to, and the small pin coming up couples to our depth of field pointer. If they are not all in a plane, then things don't move properly. So I'm just running a bit of molybdenum paste around that groove that the cam runs in. And that should sit something like that. Our other depth of field pointer here is like its mate, very, very dirty and sticky with dried out lubricant. I need to get all of that filth off there. Both sides. These components, as I've said, are pretty lightly built, easily damaged. You have to be careful not to bend them at all. That should be fine. Now that should drop in to the other depth of field pointer position. Now the little slot in the top of this has to couple to that pin that's coming off on our cam. And I've got to make sure that my depth of field pointers are both at the ends of their scale. So I've got to move that round one more position. Now both pointers are at the ends of their scale. They've got to be synchronised, otherwise they don't come together in the centre. Very, very disconcerting when the depth of field pointers sort of run off it slightly differently. Right, so this is our next component to go in. This is the setting lever from the back of the shutter, couples to the camera. Again, I've got to get rid of all that old grease and filth off there. Whenever you've got broad flat surfaces, particularly thin sheet materials, if they've got any oil on them, it tends to glue them together. So stuff just doesn't move smoothly. Right, so that should go on. The pin on it drops into that hole on that small cam. That's that. The spring goes over the post that the other spring was hooked to. This is the larger diameter of the two springs. My tweezers are a little bit unhelpful in their shape at the moment. I'm having trouble getting them to hold tiny springs. Obviously going to have to give them some treatment or go mad and buy some new tweezers. Alright, so that's in place. I've got 4 screws I use to help align things at this stage, well 3 screws, and I'll go and find those. But before I get to that stage, because we're getting near the closing up stage, I need to look at this component at the back here. This is the lens mount that couples to the camera itself. Now, there are 3 screws, hold 3 little metal clips in place. The clips just stop the brass depth of field pointer from getting away. Tip those out. and these components need to be cleaned. It doesn't appear very dirty. It looks a little bit oxidised, I suppose you'd say. The surface is not smooth and shiny. It's probably a little bit oxidised. It doesn't look like it's got any sort of lubricant on it, and that's probably why it was so stiff to move. The surfaces are slightly oxidised, and there was nothing in the way of lubricant to help ease its path through the world. So just give that a wipe out. I'll do the outside of the mount while I'm here. This lens is comparatively clean on the outside, apart from that bloody awful sticky tape that someone had applied in a fit of madness. Everything else looks pretty good. Okay, so this ring here, it would work in there dry if it didn't have any problems. It does seem to have a few issues. So I'm just going to run a little bit of molybdenum paste around the edge there. It doesn't need much, just needs something to make it slide a bit easier. So the inside edge and the outside surface, and on the cam surface where the depth of field rangefinder would couple to this on a Retina IIIS camera, I'd run some up that surface too. Otherwise you end up with a bit of a squeak when you set the shutter, change the focus. That's good, that's running smoothly. And then these three little retainers come in here. Now these are often a bugger to get the screws back in, because the screws are very much the same diameter as the hole in these little retainers. So it's not easy to get them to feed in smoothly sometimes.